3D printing is proving to be a disruptive technology for not only the design and prototyping space, but in the real-world applications as well. This is evident in perhaps no greater area than that of healthcare, where the technology is already being implemented to develop custom prosthetics, creating tissue for implantation, and enabling the printing of surgical tools. While there remains a number of challenges ahead, 3D printing promises the hope of contributing to a truly personalized healthcare solution for patients. Hi, I'm MDT's Editor-in-Chief, Sean Fensky, and with me today are Michael Drews, President of Vascular Sciences, Todd Goldstein, PhD candidate and lead researcher at the Orthopedics Laboratory at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research at Hofstra, and Mick Ebeling, CEO of Not Impossible Labs. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. I'd like to get started by briefly discussing some of the unique applications where 3D printing is being used in healthcare today. Mick, let's start with you.
So a little bit about what we're doing. We, back in 2013, November of 2013, I packed up some 3D printers, spools of plastic, some laptops, and I left for the Sudan, a specific region in the very south of Sudan, bordering South Sudan and Sudan, called the Nuba Mountains. And the goal of the mission was to go to one of the most remote places in the earth, no electricity, no running water, and to create a 3D printed prosthetic for a young boy named Daniel who had lost both of his arms in the war. So we went over there. We were able to successfully make the trip in spite of the ceasefire ending kind of mid-trip. And Daniel was able to feed himself again for the first time in 2 years. But for us, the big accomplishment that we were most proud of, obviously Daniel being able to feed himself was an amazing story, but we were able to teach the village of people there to be able to 3D print. So when I flew back and I landed in Los Angeles, I flipped on the phone and I received 2 emails from Dr. Tom Catena, the managing doctor in this hospital, of 2 prosthetics that were made while I was actually in the air. So, and this is actually, I have an example. This is a prototype of, or an example of the arm that we made for Daniel. So you can see, very simple, very crude, but incredibly functional in terms of what it's able to accomplish.
Great, thank you. Todd, can you want to say a few words about some of the current applications?
So I'm more in the realm of using this for tissue engineering. So in my lab, we are working on using 3D bioprinting to create, bones and cartilage and tracheas. So recently, we've worked on producing a tracheal segment, which has multiple different cell types, and also uses PLA and along with the living cells. So we have our own manufacturing process that we're working on and creating, so we can actually put it all down at once. You can do the PLA and the cells and actually keep them alive. So it's a different realm, but also a similar way to help children who have breathing issues to be able to breathe on their own and function.
Yeah, pretty remarkable project. And Mike, you want to speak to some of the other areas?
Sean, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion, and I apologize, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. So I'd like to just real quickly tick through about 4 or 5, excuse me, 4 or 5 applications that most people are not doing right now. You mentioned surgical instruments. Well, imagine this not so hypothetical scenario. You're in an OR, a physician calls for a scalpel, but unlike in traditional surgery where a nurse picks up a scalpel and gives it to the surgeon, the physician's voice is picked up by a voice recognition system fed into the 3D printer, and then a scalpel miraculously shows up for the surgeon to use. The surgeon uses that scalpel to do what they need to do. They then, instead of throwing it into trash, they throw it into the recycle bucket where those materials are used all over again. Think that's Star Trek-y? It's actually not. Intellectual property has been developed for that, some of it developed by myself, and we're, believe it or not, doing it in all places, Haiti. The second quick example is an implant. We now have actually 3D printed devices that have been implanted in a patient's body in a permanent way. A permanent implant is defined by FDA, has a greater than 29-day indication, but we have devices in patients for actually much longer than that. The third example is combination products. A combination product is not just a medical device or a drug or a biologic, but a combination of all three of those things. And we're actually now printing devices that either have already or could be loaded with drugs or biologics to be implanted in patient. And the fourth example is printing pills. So we actually now are printing pills that contain medications that can then be literally picked up and swallowed by the patient, just like a pill that you would buy in the pharmacy. And last and certainly not least, quintessential example of biomedical 3D printing is printing of living tissue. Now the question becomes, what could we use this living tissue for? Well, it's one thing to talk about using this tissue for replacement of organs, but quite frankly, anybody can think of that. What else could we use this tissue for? Well, we could actually use it for testing drugs. To bring a drug onto the market is an extraordinarily efficient process. And so we can actually use this, what I call engineered tissue, to totally turn the way we do drug clinical trials upside down. It's one of many examples of how medical device companies and drug companies can be working together to do, as we would say here in Boston, some really wicked cool stuff. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the beginning. The best is yet to come.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, those are some fantastic innovations. Kind of brings us into the next question. What's ahead for 3D printing in healthcare, and where does it stand to make the biggest impact? We'll go back to Mick for that one.
I think that, the way that we look at 3D printing right now, and obviously my colleagues on this phone call are doing some amazing and wicked cool stuff. We kind of look at this from the standpoint of lowest common denominator. So we're looking at ways to predominantly work with the external creation of devices or technology or solutions that will replicate or replace much more expensive solutions. So I think what we're most excited about is not necessarily the creation of the next greatest thing, but the replication and disruption of more expensive, harder to acquire things. So it's a pretty simple principle of how we operate, but our principle is technology for the sake of humanity, and I think the 3D printer represents the equivalent, it's been said before, of the printing press in a box. Except for now, we're not just printing, little black marks on white pieces of paper, but we're actually printing up, or the potential to print up solutions that can truly change people's lives. So that's how we approach everything in 3D printing is, what's the functional, hyper-functional, lowest common denominator need, and how do we replace, replicate, or disrupt that which is already fulfilling that need.
Great. And Todd, you want to take that as well?
So for me, working in the biologics and solely in the biologics. For us, we imagine something where you can make a huge impact. So let's say you're in the OR and the doctor goes, oh, well, we need to replace out 3/4 of the liver, or we have to cut it out, or a kidney or something like that. Well, you can just go, okay, at the start of the surgery, they go, all right, let's take out some cells. We can bioprint them into a new organ, and let's say 3 hours later, by the time the surgeon is actually ready to put this back into the patient, they're on the table, and it's kind of like on-the-spot demand for organs. We're trying to figure out ways to do this now with bone and cartilage, stuff that you can do, so it's a one-stop shop, basically. You can replace the organ on the table. So now this would cut the list for organ transplants down, and you could do this anywhere in the world, just like where Mick is talking about, where it's lowest fruit to work on it. So you think all of a sudden you can send these type of printers to anywhere in the world. They can do these surgeries if they're trained and actually create the organs on the spot in the OR. So that's a world that we're looking to push forward to.
Pretty amazing.
And that would make a huge difference in a lot of different surgeries that are going on.
Absolutely. And Mike, we'll come to you for the next generation or what's ahead.
Well, I already shared with you and your audience, Sean, some of my favorite applications for 3D printing in the future. But from an opportunity perspective, I think one of the greatest opportunities in the future of 3D printing is really not a technological one, but a regulatory one. The regulatory path, more specifically to bring devices or products, I should say, like this to market through the FDA, is truly the wild, wild west. And to me, that represents some huge opportunities, not just to get these products onto the market, but to do so in a way where you can actually use the regulation to create a barrier to entry to your competition. This is what I call competitive regulatory strategy. So in other words, how can I bring my 3D printing technology on the market, not just to get it on the market, because then again, anybody, any monkey can do that. I want to be able to get it onto the market and at the same time make it more difficult for the people following in my footsteps to get theirs onto the market as well. And because the regulation is very, very poorly defined in this area right now, that's a tremendous opportunity to do that.
Okay, great, and we'll definitely try and touch on more regulatory issues later in the discussion. For right now, I'm gonna go back to Mick and ask what are, in addition to regulatory, what are some of the other challenges for this technology in healthcare, 3D printing, that is?
I mean, I think for us in terms of the challenges, it's really an acceptance of this as a viable alternative and solution. And the reason we are doing that and approaching it the way that we're approaching it is we're not really looking for the medical world's acceptance of this. This is a solution whose acceptance or adoption is really dependent upon the people that these solutions will seek to serve in the first place. So it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be polished, but if it accomplishes this fundamental need and you're able to get it and circumnavigate the insurance companies or the medical bureaucracies or the FDA or any of these things, because what we do is always free or incredibly cheap and we publish how to do it online, we don't seek to be a distribution system. We don't seek to be or retain IP around the devices that we're creating. We're seeking the disruption and the distribution of the things that we're doing. So for us, the limitations are less on regulatory bodies or governmental organizations or the medical profession as a whole, and more about just getting the knowledge and information to the masses who can actually utilize it, and then because our theory is open source, they can actually make it better. For us, we would consider it to be a failure that within months after releasing one of the things that we've created into the marketplace, if it hasn't been made better, faster, stronger by the crowd, and our original product or invention or innovation almost be obsolete within a couple month period.
Yeah, and I think that open source tie-in is certainly something worthy of perhaps even its own discussion. I think that brings in a whole new element to the 3D printing technology. Appreciate. Todd, would you like to comment on some of the challenges?
Sure. So in my realm, there are so many challenges and so many hurdles that we have to deal with. Not only the fact that there's the FDA and regulatory issue to deal with, but also creating a lot of the customized tools we need to make this a streamlined process from 3D printer into patient is a extraordinary technological challenge. As well, having physicians willing to take this step to work out, take and do trials on things. When there are treatments available for all this stuff, they might not be the best treatments, and saying like, hey, we have this great technology, we want to try and expand it out and actually treat people with it. But if there's an alternate surgery available, they'll be more leaning towards that because it's true and tried. For us, though, we started working on some of the different types of pathologies that don't have any treatments and are working forward. So our acceptance now has to do with the FDA and regulating all the different governmental bodies moving forward. So which is in itself an entire discussion and also a huge challenge.
Great, thanks for that. Those insights. Mike, we'll come to you. Other than the regulatory, what are some of the challenges that you foresee or have encountered?
So that's a great question, Sean. And as already has been discussed, there are a lot of challenges. I'll just mention two, one on the material side and the second on the machine side. So first on the materials, when it comes to biomedical applications of 3D printing, especially when you're talking about putting devices inside of patients, quite frankly, the material selection that we have to choose from is pretty bad, to be polite, and extremely limited. And so clearly we need better materials that we can use to make these kinds of products out of. But on the flip side, it really, quite frankly, is kind of nuts to continue to use the 3D printing machines, which largely come from the aerospace and automotive and other industries, to be able to use materials that are specifically designed for biomaterial applications. For example, if we talk about making materials out of proteins, or acids or lipids or carbohydrates, true biomedical polymers, never mind putting cells in these things, the whole notion of being able to use the existing machines to print products like that, and please notice I'm not calling them medical devices, I'm calling them products. In many ways these are combination products. You know, we need better machines, we need better materials, and we need more people working on those things.
Great. You know what? I want to jump back to something that Mick had mentioned, and that was the open source aspect. I'm going to go back to you, Mick, for this one. On open source, you know, open source combined with 3D printing, as you kind of alluded to, brings in a whole bigger development aspect to make things better, to keep them updated. How does the open source movement tie into 3D printing, and what benefits does it bring?
Well, you know, I think if you look back to, you know, the origins of why essentially the medicine man was created, there was a personal need coming from an individual or a family to try to get outside help or support in regards to some kind of medical issue. And, you know, through potions or prayers or, you know, sticks or what have you, those inventions or creations or treatments were invented. And I think that when you look at what open source really is just a representation of unfettered sharing of information. And for the large part, that's what the internet represents. You know, you could say the most crazy, bizarre thing, Google it, come up online, and you can learn about it right away. So there's this near infinite access to information. And I think what all we're trying to do with the work at Non Impossible is to take that into the physical realm, and take that into the physical realm as it relates primarily right now to things that apply to someone's medical condition. And again, these are external conditions. So I think that the way that medicine will exist in the future, if you look at smart patients, you look at patients like me, you look at data sharing, information sharing, you just have this, the sum of the intelligence of the masses will always be greater than the sum of the intelligence of even a room of distinguished professors or doctors or MDs. The sum of that intelligence and physical experience and hands-on, you know, day-to-day interaction with a disease, there's going to be able to provide information to doctors, to patients, to other people who are co-suffering from that particular syndrome to be able to help that situation get better. And I think that's what open source really represents, is that unfettered sharing to information so that people have access to better treatment.
Great. Now, Todd, is open source as big a factor in, say, tissue engineering and 3D printing of tissue? Is that really, come into that realm, or is that really not quite a fit?
So the tools that we use to create these constructs and these tissue engineered grafts, we make them available open source just because we want other people to actually be able to do similar stuff to create this environment to help each other. Like Mick was saying, where they have all the power and masses. However, because you have to have quality control along this in the health professions, it's kind of hard to do everything open source, because you really need to have these things super controlled and follow through all the different regulations. So and I'm unaware of any sort of machine that was open source that you can create something to, grow cultures and stuff like that to implement into a person. A lot of that stuff is controlled by large companies because it's a big investment to get this to work and they want to get a return on their money, which I understand. However, in the research and development phase, we try to make everything available open source. We publish papers about how to do this, what's in it. Even the detailed methods are a lot of open source journals. So we support it, but it's an interesting tightrope we have to walk on according to figure out the best way forward.
Great. And Mike, we're going to go to you. What's been your experience with open source, specifically to 3D printing with in healthcare?
Well, that's a good question, and I would like to just amplify a little further what Tom's just saying in terms of the regulatory challenges when it comes to software in general, but open source software in particular. One of the important differentiations in using 3D printing in the biomedical world, as opposed to perhaps other industries, is we have things like design controls, we have things like verification and validation, and so bottom line, that makes it a real challenge when you're using software that, shall we say, is not real buttoned up or locked down. And that is not going to make it any easier to get you through the regulatory or FDA process. So the best advice I can give for companies who are wanting to use open source software and then actually commercialize it, bring it onto the market, is to do the following. If you don't want to start from the beginning, that's fine. Use an open source product, but as soon as you get it to the point where it's doing what you want it to do, lock it down and now go through the traditional design control, verification, and validation, and don't make any more changes to it. So that's the only, the best piece of advice that I can give in handling the open source challenges from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, great. And then you kind of led us right into our next question, which is, I'll start with Mick. What regulatory changes need to occur for 3D printing to move forward?
If I could just ask a question to Michael. So Michael, your advice on this is to once something is submitted not to make changes. Did I understand that correctly?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And to be honest, that has nothing to do with software. That's a dilemma that we face in medical device development all the time. But bottom line, in order to commercialize something, you need to have it go through design controls, assuming that it's a Class 2 or Class 3 product. If it's a Class 1 product, a lot of those devices are exempt from design controls. But nonetheless, you have to have it locked down, at least for the current generation. And then, of course, you can make changes for the future. There are ways, for example, doing a letter to file, where you can make a change in a design. Again, I don't care if you're talking about a physical widget or a piece of software. Philosophically, it doesn't matter. There are ways to make changes in a design without going through a formal regulatory review, i.e. 510K or PMA. We can do that with something called a letter to file, but that's a topic of a whole different discussion. And if you're interested in doing that, we need to talk about it further, because it is an option, but it's also an option that gets a lot of medical device companies into trouble very, very frequently.
So I think that's my question really originates from just a distinction in terms of the views represented on this chat, is that I think that the views that I express or I'm expressing about how we go about this, we're not really thinking about regulatory bodies. We're not really thinking about how to get something through a system. Just the mere concept or the words "don't change something once it's submitted" is just like sends shivers down my spine, as that's not how we think. We think if there's a way to make it better immediately, and then disclose that. Release early, release often. Get it as quickly out there in the marketplace as possible. But not necessarily that one is right or one is wrong. I just fundamentally, where we come from, our position is that if somebody needs widget A, device A, and then who is any regulatory body to say that, oh, well, you can't have that yet. You need to wait until you fill out, a cover page to your TPS report. That's just not something that's something that we even contemplate in terms of how we think. Our entire process is just, let's get it out there as quickly as possible. Let's let the community and the crowd refine it and test it, find the errors, and there will be errors, and have them continue to push it forward.
Yeah. And I get to say that I am trapped between those two worlds.
Oh, I'm sure, and that's why I was very, very clear to say that I don't think that one world is right or one world is wrong. It's just the way that we operate is it's a bit of a Robin Hood, it's a bit of a like, power to the people. How do you get it to them as quickly as possible? But we're not dealing with chemicals, or we're not dealing with things that are in the pharmaceutical world. We're dealing with things that are more physical.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, the obviously serving Sudan with the technology the way you did. I think you're obviously dealing with a much greater obstacles to success beyond FDA regulation. I mean, you're enhancing life, but does that mean that the way we're doing things should be changed, or is there a time and place for each aspect? I think that
Oh, I can answer that. I think the way that we do things in this country should absolutely be changed. I don't know. I don't think there's a person in the medical profession, be it academic or practicing, who would disagree with that. It's just a question of how much it needs to change and how quickly we can prove it to be more efficient, be a more efficient system. I think we need to, once you are governed by the capitalistic tendencies of insurance companies or medical facilities or things like that, then you automatically have something in conflict with the Hippocratic Oath, and therein lies kind of the thing that has to be navigated, and quite frankly will always be navigated, because while what we're trying to do is trying to take things to the masses and try to get things to them as quickly as possible, we also believe in capitalism. We believe that the way to progress is to actually to incentivize people to progress and to kind of constantly invent things. So I think that things absolutely need to change, just to strike that point yet again.
Great, thank you. And Todd, we'll go to you. And I know obviously you walk like you've mentioned, you walk a tightrope. That's obviously a much more difficult area to work in with regard to regulatory situations. So what are your thoughts on regulatory changes that are needed with regard to 3D printing?
So I think the whole concept, and I can only speak towards actual, implanting this inside the human, not dealing with prosthetics, not dealing with the surgical tools, etc. Just using 3D printing as a way for tissue creation. So for us, there more needs to be just a definition of what you need to do to process your tissue to be allowed into it. What is deemed safe? What is deemed not safe? How does the process even affect the cells? Because that kind of stuff isn't defined by the FDA. It hasn't been a thing. And like it was said before, it's the wild west of this stuff. Everyone's on the race trying to get this done first, and no one's really sure what the actual outcome should be or can be. So for me to make these constructs and then implant them, that's great. However, the government hasn't quite, or the FDA and all the regulatory bodies haven't said, okay, this is what's considered a success. You can go to the market. Whereas no, this is a failure, and these are the reasons what you need to, why you need to adjust it. So it's an interesting kind of time to sit through, and especially for someone to sit and watch how these things are going on. It's really, really interesting. So it's kind of like, I think one of the 3D printer companies said that they're leading the next industrial revolution. Well, this here is kind of like the next medical revolution of how we're creating drugs, prostheses, treatments, etc.
Great. Yeah, no, it's definitely an exciting and interesting time for this technology. Mike, we'll jump over to you, and I know you've already said a bit about regulatory issues and challenges, but do you have anything additional, the way perhaps regulatory or what regulatory changes would be necessary for 3D printing to really grow within the healthcare industry?
Well, that's a great question, Sean. Thanks for the opportunity to chime in. I don't think we need a regulatory change. I think we need a regulatory system specifically designed for personalized medicine. 3D printing of medical devices is personalized medicine, just like pharmacogenomics is to drugs or biologics. From a regulatory or a philosophical perspective, it's exactly the same thing. And really, our current regulatory environment is not designed, either on the device side or the drug side, for personalized medicine. And I'll give you just one quick example. In the medical device world, as I'm sure some in your audience know, we have a few medical devices have been 3D printed and brought to market using the 510K. In my opinion, that's nuts. the 510K, the PMA, the HDE, the de novo, all of the commonly used medical device pathways to market, they are not the appropriate pathway to market we should be using for personalized medicine of medical devices, in this case 3D printing. I have actually said publicly for the last several years that the best regulatory pathway to market that we have at the moment, this is by no means ideal, but the best one that we have today is also the least commonly used, and that is something called the custom device exemption, or the CDE. I have actually also said publicly that in the future, the CDE has the potential to become as commonly used, perhaps even more commonly used, than the 510K. And to many people, when they hear me say that, they think, oh, this guy must be nuts. He must be smoking his socks. Well, the CDE is the closest thing that we have to personalized medicine. It is by no means ideal, and I really think we need something better. And we have had discussions at FDA about creating a new regulatory pathway, which I think should be the same for pharmacogenomics for drugs, but the topic of a different discussion. And I'll leave you with one last comment to think about on this one, Sean, and that is the regulatory framework is designed for blockbuster products. In other words, if you're bringing a product onto the market, whether it's a medical device or a pill, I don't care, and your intended patient population is thousands or tens of thousands or millions, it makes sense to do a clinical trial of perhaps a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred patients. But in personalized medicine, whether we're talking about 3D printing or pharmacogenomics, it doesn't matter, where your intended patient population is one person. What does a clinical trial even look like for one person? Now, there is a solution to that problem. As an engineer, when I look at a clinical trial, and I spend some of my time designing trials for companies, I spend some of my time evaluating clinical trial designs for the FDA. So when I look at a clinical trial as an engineer, I see nothing more than a validation. And there's two ways that we can do a validation. One way is to validate the product, and the way we do clinical trials today is to validate the product. But the other way we can do a the other way we can do a validation is to validate the process. And so I think the answer to that question of how do you regulate, how do you do a clinical trial of personalized medicine, again, devices or drugs, it doesn't matter to me, is to focus on validating the process. That's the secret sauce, not the product. And the very last thing that I'll say with regard to Todd's work in the area of printing tissues, although from a technology perspective that's wicked cool, from a regulatory perspective there is precedent to that already. We've been doing it in decades, or for decades. For example, when we take tissue from one person and plant it into another person, or when we take tissue from an animal, a xenograft, for example, and implant it into a person. We've been doing this in medicine for decades. In the former case, FDA has nothing to do with that because that's the practice of medicine. In the latter case, the FDA has something to do with that, but it's still not real clear as to what, even though we've been doing it for a long time. Now we get to the apex of that pyramid. When we're talking about printing tissues, the question that we need to start out with is, what, if any, should FDA's role be in that to begin with? Because is that really any different fundamentally than taking tissue from another person or from an animal? Certainly something to be thinking about. These are questions that we as an industry need to think about and discuss, but these are also questions, more importantly, as a society, that we need to talk about and discuss.
Great, some great insights there. Mick, I'm going to share with you a reader question that we got asking about materials, and they asked if you were aware of any other materials beyond PLA and ABS that were going to be able to be used for 3D printing.
As of right now, most of the things that we do and explore are in the consumer grade, so that's ABS and PLA. But I mean, you just have to look back a couple years to see the demise of the laser printer or the color printer and see that the economics around that are based in the filament or based in the ink and not in the printer. So I think you're going to start to, I mean, you've already seen people printing in sugar and printing with organic substances. You're seeing people printing in carbon fiber, and there was, people printing in concrete and cement. So I think that the amazing thing that's going to happen, and I'm not any soothsayer because the handwriting is already on the wall, in the different materials that the 3D printers are going to be able to spit out. That's going to be the great thing. And there's I just met with a young boy up in Seattle who printed in ABS, but then put a different coat onto, just kind of almost a spray coat onto the plastic, and it made it just tough as steel. So I think that you're going to also start to see things that you can do to the after extruded filament that will seal it, will cure it, and will turn it into, you know, better, stronger, faster.
Wow, that's an interesting angle I hadn't considered with the coating technology that may be able to be added to maybe a framework or a finished part. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Great, Todd. I know yours is more of a niche area, but are you seeing material innovations in your space?
So I could probably spend about 3 hours just talking on the different materials that we use in, especially my space. But like some of the stuff that I've seen is a lot of different blends of materials. So you know, PLA with limestone, PLA with iron, bronze. We have polycaprolactone, PCl, and PVL, and then also all these other various composites. Also in the biologics, anything that you can form into like a jello type substrate, you can print it. You know, using alginates, using different types of collagens, also sugars. I mean, even metals. You can, if you really wanted to, you could probably mix and match anything that you wanted to, and you could come up with a new types of composite. I know we do that on a daily basis here. We mix different types of composites to get the correct correct time we want in the body before it breaks down. So this is going to be a huge boom for the 3D printers to get away from just two types to anything you can think of.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what would be expected to be coming down the line. Mike, you want to speak to the material innovations aspect for 3D printing?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. As I said earlier, I think there's a lot of challenges on the material side as well as on the machine side. And those two things are intimately related to one another, because in biology, the materials that we really would like to use are very finicky, very delicate materials. And quite frankly, we need more delicate machines to deal with them if we're going to print them in a biological sense of the word. But once again, one of the biggest challenges that we face here is on the regulatory side. And let me just back out of 3D printing for a second and just talk about from a general medical device and material perspective. We have lots and lots of companies, medical device companies, bringing medical devices onto the market, more than anybody could possibly count. But on the other hand, how many companies do we have that are developing truly new, truly novel biomaterials? The answer is very, very, very few. And that's another one of these things that's really holding us back. And actually, we have created disincentives for companies to do this. Because think about this, if a medical device company has a choice between bringing a new device onto the market made out of an existing material, or what I sometimes refer to as a bio-friendly material, versus a new device out of a new material, 99.9 times out of 100, they're going to choose the existing material because it is easier. But it is also really holding us back. And never mind when you get into some of these funkier biomaterials that are bioabsorbable. When a material breaks down in the body, not just physically but chemically, now you're getting suspiciously close to the bailiwick of CEDAR, to the drug side of the FDA, and this is something that historically the medical device industry has really wanted to stay away from. But one of the things I spend a lot of my time doing is helping companies commercialize truly new, truly novel technology where there are technical and regulatory challenges, but we don't believe those are challenges that cannot be solved. And but unfortunately, the vast majority of people working in this industry, at least from my experience, have become very risk averse, and they just simply want to take the path of least resistance. And so as a result, as I've said a couple of times, it pains me to say it, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Even in the 3D printing world, it's really holding us back. It's not the technology that's holding us back. It's not the science. It's not the regulation that's holding us back. It's people's attitudes. Present company excluded, of course, but it's people's attitudes that's holding us back.
Great. Thanks for that. And I just want to take a minute to give each of you just maybe a final thought, a sum up statement on 3D printing in healthcare, kind of whatever angle you want to take. Mick, we'll start with you.
Sure. You know, at the risk of being repetitive, you know, I think that the the angle that we approach this at, and the way that we view the 3D printing is 3D printing is just another soldering iron. It's just another hammer, or screw, or nail, if you will. It's just another tool in the return of the power, or the circumnavigation of the bureaucracy to the people who actually need it. So we believe that if people need something, that they will go to whatever ends they can to get that, especially if it's something to provide a quality of life, or a medical relief, or some kind of freedom of mobility or expression to a loved one. And what we seek to do is to just try to make that more accessible. So I think 3D printing is an incredible tool, but the tool that we at Not Impossible really try to tap into and to promote is this just tool of ingenuity. And if you could accomplish the same thing by hacking open and breaking open something that already exists, an electric toothbrush or something like that, and it can accomplish something just by rewiring it or recreating it in some fundamental way to accomplish what you need, and you don't have to 3D print, then fantastic. For us, the 3D printer, though, obviously provides so much access to creating exactly, specifically with what you want and what you want it to accomplish. So that's why we're so excited about the tool and use it in so many other areas. But for us, it's more of this fundamental concept of technology for the sake of humanity and necessity really leading to the creation of incredible inventions.
Fantastic. Todd, I'll let you have a final word, a final thought.
Just really say that people who don't have exposure to 3D printing, that they shouldn't be scared to just go jump into it. Go to one of the different various stores or download one of the free softwares, try to print something out, because they kind of have to explore, try it out, and get involved in doing something that potentially could really have a good impact on humanity. Whether it's a prosthetic, a tool, or even an idea, it's something that you can rapidly prototype in this 3D printing ecosystem. Just get out and just try it, because ideas can come from anywhere and from people of all different walks of life. So you really should just do your research and get involved.
Great, thank you. And Mike, your final thought, final comment.
Well, thanks, Sean. And again, I would just amplify what Todd just shared. I think what he was describing is Nike's philosophy is do it. I agree with that. Bottom line, 3D printing technology, especially in medicine, is, as we would say here in Boston, wicked cool. It has the potential to change this not just this industry, but this world in a number of ways, not just in evolutionary ways, but more importantly in revolutionary ways. And with all due respect to my many friends that are working in this area right now, the stuff that we're doing today, although it's the beginning, it's a step in the direction, it's the tip of the iceberg, and the best is yet to come. And finally, because I do spend a lot of my time helping medical companies bring new revolutionary technologies onto the market through the FDA and Health Canada and organizations like that, I think we really need to work with these regulatory agencies to do this better. Because quite frankly, if everybody waited for somebody else to be the first ones, we'd also be still living in caves. And this is really holding us back. Yes, there are challenges. There are technical challenges. There are biological challenges. There are clinical challenges. There are engineering challenges. There are medical challenges. There are regulatory challenges. There are reimbursement challenges. There are manufacturing challenges. There are intellectual property challenges. There are a lot of challenges, but all of those challenges are solvable problems. And the first thing that has to happen, as Todd just said a moment ago, is we need people stepping up to the plate and say, yeah, this sounds like it's a difficult problem, but I'm willing to give it a shot. And unfortunately, in this risk-averse industry that we've evolved into, there aren't too many people that are doing that anymore. On the regulatory side, I refuse to be labeled as the regulatory police. In so many organizations, the regulatory folks, I hate to say this, they're viewed as the police because they're constantly telling people what they cannot do. I do not take that approach. As I was in a company just this morning, I said to them, you tell me what you want to do, and I will figure out at least one, probably more than one way to get it through the FDA. That's the kind of attitude that we need, not to focus on what we cannot do, but rather to focus on what we can.
Fantastic, and I think that commentary stretches well beyond 3D printing. To wrap up, I just want to thank everyone who has tuned in today to watch our discussion on 3D printing. Certainly will be a topic that we keep up to date on as we continue to inform you of new innovations in the space. For Mike, Todd, and Mick, I'm Sean Fensky, Editor-in-Chief of MDT, and this has been MDT Live's look at the impact of 3D printing on healthcare. Thank you.